Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Z, and welcome to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. Today, I'm going to be discussing Diddy, specifically the ID docuseries Fall of Diddy that is now currently streaming on Max and Discovery Plus. I'm going to be speaking with Mara S. Campo. Mara was recently in the docuseries and sat down with Diddy's former assistant, Phil Pines. Today, Mara and I are going to get into the accusations against Diddy, the docuseries, the interview of people coming forward, sharing their stories, and what that means on a larger scale for trauma and abuse survivors. A little bit about Mara S. Campo. Mara S. Campo is a beauty founder, four-time Emmy award-winning TV journalist, iTunes #1 podcast host, wife, and mom of two based in Harlem, New York. She's known as the hair lady on social media. Mara's do-it-yourself hair hacks have repeatedly gone viral all over the world with more than 120 million views over the last year. Her social media success led her to the launch of her wig and hair extensions line, Hair by Mara. Mara was most recently the co-host of Discovery's ID's true crime show Crime Feed and the global news anchor and managing editor of Revolt News on Revolt TV. She previously worked as a correspondent and anchor for Good Morning America and The Today Show. Mara was the creator, host, and executive producer of the Trend Reporter podcast, which was #1 in fashion and beauty and iTunes Top 200 overall, with more than 1 million downloads, which ran for 2 seasons and covered the latest trends in beauty and wellness. This episode may be triggering for some. If you haven't seen the ID docuseries Fall of Diddy yet, I do recommend it, again, with a trigger warning. But I think that this conversation with Mara is needed and I think is going to really help survivors be able to relate and feel safe coming forward with their stories. Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Z. Welcome to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. Today, I have somebody very special with us whose brain I cannot wait to pick. We have Mara Campo with us, and I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself and how I got you here. But I'm going to first hand it over to you, introduce yourself, and then we're going to jump into it. We're going to be talking about, for those of you that have not seen it yet, the docuseries Fall of Diddy. Before I give away too much, I just wanted to thank you, Mara, for being here to talk about such a difficult topic for so many people. So many people have been impacted by this. There are so many people that I work with that can't even bring themselves to watch this docuseries. And I think that that's the whole point of this. And so I'm going to hand it over to you, introduce yourself, and then we're just going to jump right into it.
All right, well, thank you for having me. I'm Mara S. Campo. I am a journalist and a beauty founder, and I am a contributor to the documentary The Fall of Diddy, which is streaming now on Max and Discovery Plus. And I also conducted a sit-down interview as part of the series with one of Diddy's former executive assistants.
So I want to jump right into this. For you, as a female, in this role that you were in, I would imagine that for anybody, in general, but particularly as a female, hearing these stories and hearing the allegations that were brought to light, really stemming from 2016 video of Cassie that had kind of blew up all over the internet and has resurfaced in this docuseries. But just seeing these images and hearing these stories from men and women, as a journalist, kind of what comes up for you when you see this?
I've been covering crime for a long time, so in a lot of ways, it can become very clinical for me. You're heavily reliant on documents, and you're reading through documents, and you're trying to identify like what the specific claims are, and you're dissecting it in that way. What was unique about this particular story, there were a few things. The first is Cassie's lawsuit. So when I first read Cassie's lawsuit, I will say this is the worst civil suit I have ever read. And I mean that what I mean by that is kind of the level of detail and the allegations that were made in the civil suit. You don't generally see that in a civil suit. You generally see that in a criminal complaint. So to see it in a civil suit and to get this first person account, because this was Cassie's claim, and she is saying, these are the things that took place, that was really, really shocking because this was the first time that the public was hearing this level of allegation against Diddy. Then the tape came out, and that was just jaw dropping because remember, he had denied that there was any physical abuse against Cassie initially. And now this tape comes out. There was no way that he could possibly deny what we saw. And of course, there was that subsequent apology. But the tape was just shocking in how clear it was. You often have people who are trying to rationalize or justify or make excuses or, are they believing the alleged victim? And in this case, it was just so clear. So that was really shocking as well. And then when I screened the documentary, there was one person who came forward in particular with her claim that she was sexually assaulted by Diddy, and she describes a very brutal, violent sexual assault. And you generally don't hear victims describe their assault in that level of detail. And that was just, I mean, it's hard to listen to.
One of the things that you said in the docuseries that hit me, and I get like choked up when I say this, but one of the things that you said in the docuseries that hit me in the gut, and it's something that I had seen when I was watching it and had the same thoughts you did, but and I was so happy that you said it, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, that she wasn't wearing shoes in the video. And you had said that. And I think in that moment, it really makes people stop. And so what I'm talking about, what Mara had said in the docuseries was that in this video, one of the things you see is Cassie is, sneaking out, trying to get out, and she has no shoes on. And if you think about that for a second, and you said this yourself, which was it was just so jarring. Imagine how panicked and scared you need to be to run out of a room with no shoes, to run outside in the public with no shoes, right? I mean, that's just a kind of this fundamental, just, I don't even know how to explain. I don't even have words for that. But the fact that she ran out, no shoes, just tells you really how much of kind of in her mind, this was a life or death situation and she needed to get out. And it's one of those things I think that just sticks in your mind. And I think, to your point and to what you said, it sounds like you felt that same way.
Yeah, and like I said, I've been covering crime a long time. I've seen a lot. And so it is, people who know me were actually surprised that I got so emotional on camera. And I was surprised as well that that happened. And also a little embarrassed, to be honest, because from a professional standpoint, that's, I don't aspire to get that emotional on camera. But it did, my heart just breaks because I'm thinking about how young this woman is now, but especially, was at the time. And now, I'm in my mid 40s. I'm a mom. And I just think about where I was at that place in my life when I was her age. I think about, my daughter's 13. This Cassie started dating Diddy when she was 19, a teenager. And so I have this kind of maternal response to seeing this young woman run out of the room like that. And what's really horrifying, and we don't know for sure if this is the same incident, but in some of the court filings that the federal government has filed, they describe an incident where someone is fleeing a room. They basically describe something that is exactly parallel to what we see on the tape. And part of what they allege is that that person was leaving a freak off. So if this is the same incident, and we don't know that it is, then it gives it another layer, which is that she was potentially trying to get away from a sexual assault, potentially. Again, not confirmed. We don't know that to be true. And I also really want to say this is important to say at the outset, that these are all allegations. Dade has not been convicted of anything yet. And his lawyers have been very clear in declaring his innocence and saying that they're looking forward to him defending himself in court. So we just have to acknowledge that as well.
Correct. Correct. One of the other things that was interesting to me, shocking and interesting, listening to all of these people speak and listening to all of their stories. And I'm curious from your standpoint as well, but something that kept coming up for me was the consistencies in the patterns of behavior, not necessarily the surface level details, but the underlying function of all these patterns of behavior that people were discussing occurred in their relationships with Diddy, occurred in any type of dynamic, male, female, it really doesn't matter. But there were very clear patterns of behavior that was appeared to be a very distinct playbook. And I'm curious from your standpoint if that was something that came up for you as well in hearing all of these allegations.
What I was most surprised by were the allegations of this type of behavior very, very early on. There are people in the documentary who come forward and they're sharing these allegations from when, Diddy was in college, from his childhood. So they're describing behavior that dates back decades. I think a lot of times when we see these powerful men getting in trouble, where people come forward with these awful allegations, sometimes you have to wonder, was it the power and the money that maybe corrupted them, or did that, empower them to be able to behave in this way? But in Diddy's case, many people have come forward with claims that they were seeing elements of these behaviors from the very beginning. And so if their claims are true, they would appear that this is very much who this man is.
Mm-hmm. So I would imagine that these types of patterns we know start early in childhood. The fame, the wealth, the lack of consequences for actions, all of those things that come with this clearly are not going to make that better, right? And so it enhances those behavior patterns that were already in place. What I found really interesting in the series was that regardless of the situation, whether it was with his assistant, whether it was with somebody he was dating or with somebody he was, quote, mentoring, it didn't matter who it was. From start to finish, the blueprint was exactly the same, right? It was that kind of love bombing type behavior in the beginning, which then slowly led to quote, we say the mask falling off, to feeling stuck and trapped, whether it's, fear of safety, fear of career, which is something else I want to get to, finances, just character assassination. It seemed to me that if you were in that world and you were in that music world, that there really was only one way in and one way out almost. And so I'm curious to know if that's something that you felt as well, talking to people that it almost seemed like they didn't have really much control over even their careers. It was the degree to which they allegedly allowed Diddy to control aspects of their lives. And those that were not controlled didn't move ahead.
Yeah, and control, that element of control is one of those things that we heard described from, even his very early days. And so, again, I think that's something that definitely seems to, again, if the claims are true, seems to be a pattern of behavior in his life. What's interesting, we cannot forget is how successful he was, though. I mean, we cannot, and the documentary does an excellent job. I just have so much respect for the team at Maxine, who's behind this amazing series. And what they do really, really well is, they put this in context, because the context is important. Diddy is one of the most successful music executives, businessmen, moguls in American history. And so it was working for him. His formula worked.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And we know, just behaviorism 101. We don't continue to do something unless we benefit from it. But I agree with you. It's a very fine line, because here you have somebody who's clearly musically a genius, entrepreneurial genius. And those things I think you can say as fact. They are what they are. And so it's a really awkward line to walk when you have all of these qualities of somebody. And in addition to that, you have this alleged kind of dark side to all of this. And how do you make sense of that? Right. And I think that that's also why at least from what I could tell, that a lot of people were really kind of on the fence with this because you had this massively powerful figure who isn't just in the music industry. I mean, this is somebody who has crossed over into different areas and has done so extremely well and has been extremely successful. So, Diddy has his hands in all different areas, right? And so, I would imagine that coming forward with allegations, coming forward with intense fear. I mean, you literally saw the fear and the just I don't have any other word, just fear, just like just bare fear that they felt. And even if there were situations that happened 20 years prior, all of those emotions started coming up for some of these people in that session. And so it shows you that, these are things that run deep and these are things that have been there for a long time. And if these allegations are true, Diddy's kind of persona and this empire that he has established protects him from all of this to an extent, at least till now. And so, I commend these, people for coming forward, but I've got to imagine that's extremely scary and difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why now we're seeing all of these people coming forward because they feel safe to do so. It's always hard to be the first or the second or the third to come forward with allegations against powerful people because you know what they're capable of, you know the resources that they have to be able to refute, discredit, and potentially punish you. And so with all of these cases, with all of these recent cases we've seen in years with powerful people who are being held accountable, it's when the first person goes through the door and the second, then that's when you start to get the critical mass because then the others feel safe enough. They feel like they will be believed and they will be protected, and so they feel safe enough to come forward with their accounts as well.
Yeah, yeah. And for you, I know you said that you've worked on so many, crime cases. You've seen this. We touched on it briefly in the beginning, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into it. What makes this different? Because it feels different.
Yeah. I will say, first of all, it's remarkable to me. Now, this is from a crime reporter standpoint that you have this person who is so wealthy, so powerful, so famous, so successful, and he is being accused by the government. So we're talking about the criminal charges here of conducting these activities himself. That's what's really unusual to me. When you think of like a mob boss, right? They're directing traffic. They're telling their underlings what to do. But there are several instances in the federal government's filings that describe Diddy conducting criminal activity by his own hand. And one that just kind of made my jaw drop, and this was in the response to one of his bail hearing applications. So he, of course, was trying to get on bail. So he multiple times was seeking bail, and the government has to respond every time that you ask for bail. They have to say why they think you shouldn't get bail. And in one of their responses, they describe an incident in 2011 where they say Diddy himself broke into somebody's home and kidnapped them at gunpoint. 2011, he was already one of the richest and most famous men on the planet. So that's what's shocking is that he was allegedly um, doing these things himself, and that's really really unique. You don't really see that very often. I think we're going to learn a lot more detail in the trial. This is just the beginning because the indictment, I'll be honest, the indictment was a little thin, but given the Southern District of New York's reputation, I feel like it was thin by design. It didn't have a ton of detail in it, so I think we'll learn a lot in the trial that will fill in the gaps.
See, and that is, yes, it's extremely interesting because when you are usually, I'll say, people in positions of power who have this same kind of personality construct, will say, usually have a lot of people around them that are, quote, doing the dirty work for them or kind of handling the issues that the other person doesn't want to have their hands involved in, right? And you don't see that much with this. And I'm curious, and even in the docuseries, you didn't hear a ton of other people come up when people were talking about stories or talking about their experiences. And I found
Yeah.
that very fascinating
Well,
as
I
well.
think there's a big clue there. Diddy's the only one facing charges, and he's facing RICO charges. So RICO, it essentially says you're the head of a criminal organization, that you're using your business to conduct criminal activity, like buying drugs or securing sex workers or getting guns or taking drugs across state lines or internationally, whatever the case may be, paying bribes, threatening people, intimidation. You're using your employees and your company resources to do that. That's the claim. So that claim in and of itself implies that there were a lot of people involved carrying out those duties, his employees, but he's the only one facing charges. So that tells me that everyone is cooperating with prosecutors, which is why I think we're going to learn so much at the trial. Because it's clear that, listen, the federal government, that they want the big fish. They don't want tiny players. And so if they have to use the tiny players to get the big fish, that's what they're going to do. And it definitely appears to be the case here.
Yeah. Yeah. I found that to be, I'll just say interesting.
Yeah, definitely
We'll put it
telling.
that way. um, what do you think going into this and, interviewing the people that you did and hearing what you heard about this, did you, did you find anything in particular that you thought was, let's say, the most important thing that you would want people to know, you would want people to take from this? What would you say for you personally was, yeah, I want to say the most important thing to get out there to the public? Why was it so important for this to be out there?
Well, so just to be clear, I was not involved in the production of the documentary. I'm an on-air contributor. So I sat for an interview, and then I also conducted the interview for the fifth episode with Phil Pines, which was Diddy's former executive assistant. But what the team at Maxine, which is the production company, did so well was in putting all of this in context, because it does seem like kind of crazy. You're like, what? Like Diddy, like, especially when we first started to hear about these things, we're like, he's like the shiny suit man. And he's like, kind of like one of the cuddlier, like, hip hop artists and moguls. And so when all of this started to come out, it's like you're trying to make sense of it based on what we've seen in the public. And they did an excellent job of really telling a full story, and in bringing forth really powerful voices that share their perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to people about the series, the people that could watch it. Like I said before, some people can't bring themselves to watch it, and I completely understand why. But I was asking people, their take on it, and it was interesting. A couple people had actually said to me, I'm not, I'm not ready yet." Meaning, I'm not ready yet to let go of the way I held Diddy in my mind, right? I'm not ready yet to let go of this version of him I held for so long, that he was this entrepreneur, this phenomenal entrepreneur and this musician and just so talented, and not knowing what to do with being able to hold those two things at once. And we see this a lot, right? Not just in the music industry, but we see this with a lot of people, even our own friends and family, right? We look at them one way, we hear something else, and now we have to figure out how to rationalize and justify having these two things be true at the same exact time. And, for you, I'm curious, is this something that you found that people felt kind of the same way, just in general, about this, that it's really hard to hold these two things at once?
There's kind of a grieving that takes place if you're
Yes.
someone who loved Bad Boy and everything that it stood for and everything that it brought to the world. And for me personally, that has absolutely been the case, because I grew up on Bad Boy. I'm a 90s kid who grew up on the East Coast. I looked up to Puffy. I loved every single Bad Boy artist. I mean, I was buying the CDs, I was watching the videos, I was wearing the t-shirts. I wanted to dress like them. I wanted to be. So, I mean, I was all in, and not just for like a couple years. I mean, Diddy ran radio and pop culture I mean, for me personally, I would say from like 94 to like, I don't know, when did I stop paying attention to Diddy's music? Maybe like 2004. So like 10 very formative years of my life, spanned from when I was, 14 years old to after I graduated college. I mean, that's a very formative time of your life. So it's really sad for me because it's like, no, not this too. I had the same experience with R. Kelly. I love R. Kelly's music. He is a musical genius. And I think what we're struggling, the Cosby Show, I live in a brownstone in part because when I was little, I wanted to be like the Cosbys, and I carried that dream with me my entire life. And then as an adult, my husband and I bought a brownstone. So I think we really have to try to figure out how to reconcile, how to separate the art from the artist. But we are able to do it. I mean, there are lots of things in American society and history that we hold dear that were authored by enslavers and human traffickers. So we figured out how to do that. So I think we just have to figure out how it looks, with someone like Diddy.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think that was so well said. It's a grieving process, it's a mourning process, and I think it's important that's spoken about, right? Because again, it's a weird place to be because you on one hand hear all of these horrific allegations, on the other hand, for many people this was somebody that they idolized, and it's a really hard thing to come to terms with. Um in a perfect world, what do you hope that people get from that series? What do you hope the message is for people?
In my work, the goal is always shining light and telling the truth and trying to truth people have one thing happens, you have three sides to it, right? The perspectives of two people watching and then what actually happened. But we try to get as close to the truth as possible, and I think the team here just did a really good job of presenting a very balanced, very evidence based story about this really compelling figure. And what's happening now doesn't make him less compelling. It changes how he's perceived, but it still is. I mean, this dichotomy of this musical genius, this business mogul, this person who inspired so many people, who literally changed the world, being now accused of these awful, awful crimes. So they've done a really good job of shedding light on a lot of what we didn't know.
Mm-hmm. And what about for women? What about the message specifically for women who maybe are in relationships where they're watching this and they're saying, I understand this, I get this, I am that woman?
Yeah, I mean, I love that we're in a place where victims are believed. And you probably remember this too. How many years of my life was that, a woman says she's raped, and it's like, well, what were you doing in that part of town? Why did you go to his room? What
Correct.
were you wearing?
What were you wearing?
Hadn't you had so many boyfriends before? Aren't you promiscuous? It's like the victim is always blamed and shamed. And that does seem to be something that is slowly changing. And, not a moment too soon. I will always lean on the side of believing victims because they're almost always telling the truth. Of course, allegations need to be proven in court and supported by the evidence, and everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But I do think it's important not to discredit those who have the courage to come forward, to listen, to hear. Um, and to really have a lot of compassion. One of the stories that are featured in the documentary is the woman who says that she was shot in the face by Diddy in the nightclub shooting, and she was not treated with any compassion at that time by the culture, by society, because she was viewed as someone who was trying to take down a black man. And so I think having compassion for those who come forward. Nobody wants to volunteer and
Correct.
be that person to come forward against a powerful person and have their
Correct.
life destroyed. Who would do that?
Nobody. Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think it's important to just keep that in mind and to really believe victims. And so I think this goes a very long way in achieving that.
Yeah. I think that that's a really important point that, for so long, victims just were not believed for all the reasons that you said. And now, when you put it so bluntly, right? Why on earth would anybody willingly put themselves in a situation like that, especially against somebody who is so unbelievably powerful and admired and loved? That is a position nobody wants to be in, nor I imagine them willingly putting themselves in that position. And so I really think you hit the nail on the head with that because it's true. And I love that you say that you always, you're always gonna most of the time lean towards believing survivors, and I think that that's something that's really making a shift, um, more so today, let's say, than 15, even 10 years ago. And to have women feel, I'm not going to say comfortable because I don't think anyone that you were speaking to felt comfortable, but for women to feel that they have a safe space, that they have this docuseries to be able to discuss what they wanted to say, how they wanted to say it, his assistant being, feeling safe in that environment with you to be able to speak with you, and speak openly about it as safe as they may feel, they also at the same time are probably petrified. And so I think it sends the message that it's okay to talk about this and at the same exact time be scared. And I think a lot of times victims who want to speak up are waiting till they feel safe. And that sometimes doesn't happen. Sometimes actually speaking about it and seeing that nothing happens as a result is what actually makes you feel safe. So yeah, I think that well, again, I said this in the beginning. I think you did a phenomenal job. I think you're right. The docuseries is made in such a way that really balances the facts, really balances survivor stories, and tells the survivor stories in a way that makes other people who are hearing this not only be able to relate, but realize that, okay, maybe I can say this too. Maybe I can speak up too. So if anything, comes from this, it's that I think is the message that I would imagine that it's giving survivors kind of that green light. Go ahead, you can speak. We're here for you. We're going to believe you. And I always say this, as a psychologist, survivor stories and hearing other people talk about their experiences is way more than I could ever do for anybody. I think it's so validating to hear people speak about this, particularly in this case, because again, this is allegations against somebody that's so unbelievably powerful.
Yeah.
And
And
you know,
well, one of
yeah,
the things that we also have to keep in mind, and I would love to see the laws change on this, the only reason that Cassie was able to bring her suit forward is because New York had enacted this, survivors law where you could bring a civil suit regardless of the statute of limitations. And there was only a brief window, I believe it was a year, where people could bring a suit against someone for something that happened outside of the statute of limitations. The idea that there's a statute of limitations on sexual assault to me is bananas. There should not be a statute of limitations on sexual assault because it takes victims years to process, to feel empowered enough to confront their abuser. And especially when you're talking about people who may have been very young at the time of the abuse or even minors. I mean, I would love to see the statute of limitations on sexual assault be eliminated in every state of the country. I think it's insane that you can't prosecute that crime because, well, you run out of time.
and and you bring up a good point. When people are younger, right? When these are children or teens, even or even young adults, sometimes you don't even know that what you experienced was abuse. You don't even realize that it was sexual assault. Because it could be couched in so many different ways and you've been gaslit through the years. You don't even think that what you went through was abuse. And so you may not even realize that until 30 years down the road when you have your own children and these things start coming up for you. So I agree with you on that. I think that, it's so unbelievably rare that survivors immediately speak out.
Yeah.
Rare.
Yeah.
They have to process it. They have to feel comfortable. There's so many steps before that, and I think the docuseries shows that. You're hearing stories from so long ago that are still just as present in their lives as they were when they happened.
Yeah. People need time.
Yeah. Mara, thank you so much for this. I think you're brilliant, and like I said before, I loved watching you in this. I think you did a phenomenal job. I think the docuseries did a phenomenal job of laying all this out, as you said, in a very kind of clear, concise, organized, and fair way. Um, Tell people where they can find you, find more information about this.
So I am on all social media as Mara S. Campo. So you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. The documentary, The Fall of Diddy, is streaming on Max. It's also streaming on Discovery Plus, and this was produced by Maxine Productions. They did a fantastic job.
And I will link your socials, and I'll also link the docuseries to the show notes so people who are
Okay, that would be
listening
great.
and watching can just easily reference it from there. But thank you
Okay,
so
that would
much
be
for your
great.
time. This
Thank
was
you.
wonderful, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you. I appreciate
Thank
it. All
you.
right, have a good one.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. I hope you found it useful, but most importantly, I hope you found it validating. Want to work one-on-one with me? Visit my website at drjamiezuckerman.com to book a personalized coaching session, and be sure to check out my on-demand workshops on topics like co-parenting with a narcissist, life after leaving, anxiety management strategies, and more. Again, that's drjamiezuckerman.com. You'll also find links to my interactive workbooks, merchandise, resources, and newsletter sign-up. Next Up Narcissism is as much your podcast as it is mine. I want to hear your feedback and what you want to hear. So make sure to leave a podcast review wherever you listen, or send an email to nextup@drjamiezuckerman.com. Again, that's nextup@drjamiezuckerman.com. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Make sure to tune in next week to see what's up next on Next Up Narcissism.